The World of RPGs, Episode 28, France, Part 1. Welcome to The World of RPGs, a podcast in which we travel around the globe and learn about the local role-playing game scenes. I'm your host, Mo Bartz, and in Episode 28, we are going to France. This is one of the non-English speaking countries with one of the most unique RPG scenes. So yes, this will be a multi-part episode because there's a lot to cover. Part 1 will give the general overview and history, and Part 2 and 3 has local games, different French cultures, and indie games. In personal gaming news, I read Wanderhome, played a session of Kaiju Girls at a local game cafe, and facilitated a session of Dream Apart. I had some issues understanding one of Dream Apart's game mechanisms, so I watched a German language actual play from Plot Bunny Games, which had some really cool guests like the author Benjamin Rosenbaum and Marina Weisband, who is a German public intellectual and also role player. I also finally met my co-host from the Kazakhstan episode, Matt, in person because he visited Istanbul. Now on to this episode's country. I guess one of the reasons for the vibrant French language scene is the reluctance of using English language sources. So in France, games are either translated or they just do their own thing. And I'm deliberately saying French language scene and not French scene because some upcoming episodes will also cover the French language while not being France. This will sneak into a couple of talks because interviewees will mention French language bloggers or games which are actually not from France, but in most cases from Switzerland, but that's for a different time. The main language of France is obviously French. It's a Romance language, but quite distinct from other languages from that group like Italian or Spanish, so not mutually intelligible with them. So while a person from Italy might be able to understand a Spanish book, it would be an issue for a French person. And while France is a very centralized country with lots of things happening in Paris, that's not necessarily true for the gaming scene, for example, conventions or where authors are from. There are also a number of language and cultural minorities in the country. For example, the Northwest has more Celtic influences, or there's a dialect of German spoken in Alsace. We also do need to address colonialism here. Where France stands out among other European countries is that they still have strong connections to their former colonies and have a couple of so-called overseas territories. For example, if you are in the Eurozone, in which France is a major economy, you will notice that the Euro bills have this map of Europe and then some more land and islands in some boxes seemingly outside Europe. Guess what those are? We'll come back to this topic in part 3 of this episode. Religion-wise, France is officially a secular state, but traditionally Roman Catholic, and the population is about 70 million people. Now, as for my personal connection to France, well, I do have French ancestry on my mom's side of the family, but they left France a long time ago for Quebec and Louisiana, so I don't consider myself ethnic French. I also have a French aunt, though, and of course in Germany you usually have at least some French at school. And we visited France a couple of times when I was a kid or teenager, and last time I was there was in 2023, which was when I had already started this podcast. So of course I went to some game shops in Bordeaux. I will mention that a couple of times in the interviews because I also actually talked to someone from Bordeaux in part 3. And by the way, that's also the region where my ancestors are from. But my French is so rudimentary that I usually got around in Bordeaux speaking Arabic. Now let's start with the first interview. And as has become the tradition, we start with the actual play channel from the teaser from the last episode.
So my name is Julien Dutel, and I'm an actor first. That's my job. Voice actor, actually, mainly. I began playing when I was really a kid because I had a cousin who was playing role-playing games, and I've been playing my whole life. And one day I met a publisher called Black Book Editions, which is a French publisher, and I started working with them as an author. And there was a moment where we decided to create an actual play together, and I became the actual play's co-creator and game master. And it's been 7.5 years now.
It's been a while, yeah.
Okay, and there's also a second voice. Can you introduce yourself and tell us how you got into games?
Hi, yes. I'm Ryan Hiley. I'm also an actor. I also mainly perform in voice context video games and bits and pieces like that. And I jumped on board this project not 7.5 years ago. I came later. I jumped on board in 2021, in November, I think. And on one of the formats that they created, which was using an interesting system. And since then, since 2023, I've gotten more heavily involved because I've enjoyed the format, enjoyed the people, and jumped on board in the production side as well of our show.
Now, there are lots of things I would want to go into. I don't really know how to start. Maybe, Ryan, we start. Your name doesn't look French, but you play in French. Can you say a bit about that?
Yes. Part of my story is I'm a Brit who moved to France when he was a kid. My parents moved here and I grew up here. And so I grew up with a combination of French at school. My French life just established itself through education, schooling and studies and then work. And the English grew at home. And I ended up having most of my life in French, even though today, now that I act, most of what I do is in English for the global performances that I might do.
And then about the acting, are there any games or shows that we would know? Can you give an example?
On my part, the ones I like to talk about are Road 96, which is a small indie game that had a big hit, very good one that came out. That's one I'm very happy about. But I'm in bigger titles with smaller roles, such as Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 or Neo 3, and soon Tides of Tomorrow are the titles that are kind of on the vibe at the moment. And Julian has his.
Yes, Julian, can you maybe give some examples?
For my part, I've been mostly dubbing, actually. One of the biggest shows I've dubbed in French is Secret Levels. I dubbed the third episode, if I do remember correctly, which main characters was impersonated by Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I was impersonating that character. And as for the video games, I did a few indies video games. One of them was the English version of the ABC Murders, which was released a few years ago. Not the last one, but the previous one by Microids. And I was Hercule Poirot, actually.
Now, let's talk a bit about Roll and Play. So can you say a bit about that channel, how it came to be, what you're doing there?
So Roll and Play is an actual play. We are a bunch of actors, mostly voice actors, actually, but we also have stage actors among us. A bunch of actors who decided to play role-playing games. First, we decided with Black Book Editions, which were the first producers of the show, we decided to create an actual play because that was quite cool, actually. And I said, yeah, I've got a bunch of friends who could make it really cool. And they all learned how to play. They were not playing role-playing games before. They all learned on the spot. We thought that was easier to make actors learn how to play than to make players learn how to act, actually. And so that's an actual play, which is in a system called Roll and Play, which is a version of the 5th edition. Our own version. We've got the game that has been released in France with quite a lot of books. Actually, I think around 15 books right now, something like that. Yeah. And we play adventures every week. We've been playing for the past 7.5 years. We are playing our 4th campaign in the same world every time. And yeah, we use our actor skills in order to create an improvised fiction with real acting, real emotions, huge drama, and also a lot of laughs. It's really our thing. We are players, but we are actors first.
So the excerpt I used as a teaser for the France episode, can you say a bit about that session or what that campaign was about?
That's the very first episode of the new campaign, which is called Eclipse. Well, for that very first chapter, because there are going to be a lot of chapters, we are ending our chapter on April 23rd. That very first chapter is about a bunch of adventurers who come back to their hometown and discover that they had forgotten a very dark secret. And they rediscover it, and they also realize that their native city is about to be overtaken by something really dark, and they have to fight it and to also fight the institutions, because this is a dwarven city which is xenophobic and doesn't love to let the power between the hands of other people. And they have to fight that and fight the dark thing that is rising.
At the same time,
At the same time, of course. Wouldn't be fun otherwise.
No. That was a challenging one. And in fact, you mentioned it was the first episode. We did 2 prequel episodes for this particular campaign because we rely on public funding. We're very crowdfunded. And so we have a very strong community supporting us around this adventure, around all the adventures. And this since the beginning. And we're very happy that we have this fellowship and we have a very loyal bunch of people out there helping us. And so these prequels were kind of a gift to them before the actual funding of this particular campaign to show what it was going to be about, to tease a little bit. And we're very happy because there was very massive success around it. We released them, I think, in September, October, and the crowdfunding followed that. And then we financed 2 full chapters, which for us is 1 production year with publications every Thursday evening. So that's a big mark of trust for us on this particular front.
You said it's an own system, but based on D&D 5th edition. So is 5th edition available in French?
5th edition is available in French, but at the time we started working on that version of the system, it was not. It was not even announced by Wizards of the Coast. And at very first, the publisher said, okay, they do not announce it. They released the SRD and we could do something. So we did something in the first version and then Roll and Play came, which is the second version of the system. But it's totally compatible and those who know any 5th edition game will never be lost because this is the basics of the rules and we just worked on just giving our feeling through the gaming options, which is character origins, specializations for classes or stuff like that, archetypes. And we try to differ and to have our own thing, really, with our own universe. There is a universe I've been developing for 7 years now. And yeah, that's really the French touch, actually. And it's the same regarding the rules by themselves, but different regarding the options that you have.
I think it's important to mention Julian's done a lot of work with Black Book Editions to bring extra options to this and another vibe, really, to the whole system. Everyone can understand it very quickly, as Julian's saying, but yeah, there's a lot of work that's been put in that. I think it's important to insist. And you mentioned as well the universe we're playing in, Julia. Everything from maps to cultures to systems to politics to all the interactions you might expect of a fantasy universe have also been created by Julian over time and keeps going.
And it's important to say that we started to work with Black Book Edition, but right now the actual play is self-produced by a new company called Mime Production, in which Ryan is one of the partners. I'm also one of the partners on the production side. And we are independent now from Black Book Editions, which just sold us the actual play.
So Black Book Editions is one of the bigger publishers in France, isn't it?
Actually, the biggest, I think.
So I would be interested less in the rule changes, but the setting. So what is there specific in the setting you use in the actual play or in the books?
What I like to do when I write a setting is to start with something that feels very known. So there are dwarves, there are elves, there are goblins, orcs, and stuff like that. But then I like to think about every population differently. So we all have an idea of what an elf is, a goblin is, an orc is. And though they're not like this, the orcs are seen as violent and brutal, but actually if you get into their culture, they are refined and they are not prone to violence except for very specific rituals. Or the goblins, which are seen as a nuisance and pests, which have a very developed and spiritual culture around nature and animals and spiders, which are companions and they use their eggs and stuff like that. And I come from all those things and every time I spin it in order to surprise people. As for the world, it's really large, but we've been only exploring for now a portion of the world which is called the Minean Empire, which is one huge empire inspired by, in the same time, the Roman Empire and the Greek city-states, which is a huge political entity that gives a feeling of kind of what if ancient Greece was perpetuated until year 1000. That's a huge administration, which could be cruel at some points, but very progressive at some others. I like to explore sociological issue. And I really like to think, okay, how will it work if there is no homophobia, for example? Homosexuality is completely permitted in this universe. It's absolutely normal. But how does it work? Where are the discriminations going to go? Are there some discriminations? And there are. but it's more on the part of the sexism, because there are ancient laws that are being challenged by the population right now that say that only a father can recognize a child. And if a father doesn't recognize a child, the child is considered what we called anakolos, which is a bit of a serf in medieval times, which is an under-citizen. So even if this is a citizen, is not a citizen because the father didn't recognize it. How does it work? And how do we go from that and stuff like that? And that's quite complicated to describe, but I think this is, a kind of antique medieval universe with progressive thought challenged by old reactions.
The universe is very politically rich, and I like interacting with politically rich environments. And as Julien just mentioned, the main empire, which is the Minion Empire indeed, that we're discovering more and more every time about the way this empire was born, the way it has survived, the rules and ethics and laws and moralities that we're discovering progressively over time. And also the challenges, because there are some regions in this world that are vassals, different states that are military occupied because they are new areas of exploration. And so the morality shifts in vassal states, morality shifts in military zones. How do you handle an empire that has ideas in the first place, but, to implement them, territories for whatever reason have been explored? Well, that's where the hard side comes from it. In fact, we have a way of seeing things. Let's try and implement it here and help the people locally. Well, help doesn't always look like help. And sometimes there's nuances to that. And us as adventurers, we end up in the middle of something that we try to understand and get everyone's stake in it. When you go locally, if you go and explore that orc culture, you meet an orc at home. He's a nice guy. He's got a family. He's just trying to live life. You meet an orc on a battlefield. Well, wow, I didn't realize that there was that much cleavage between our interests in this world. And so I love the fact that this universe allows us, if you take a step back, you're in a big mess. If you take a step close, you realize that everyone has quite a sane sense of interest. And if you look at every detail of someone's life, whoever they are, whatever the horizon, you will find reasons that make sense that is what it is. And so the complexity that Julien's managed to wield through there, because there are, of course, neighboring kingdoms, there are neighboring systems, there are kingdoms run by faiths, kingdoms run by magic that are not necessarily aligned with the main empire's vision. And so how do we handle those challenges? And little by little, we haven't explored everything, as he mentioned, but I think it's excitingly rich, and I can't wait to see the rest of it.
There are two particularities that are important now that I think of. Firstly, it's how magic meddles in the world, because in the Empire, magic is strictly controlled. Mages don't have the right to have a political position at any point. They could be advisors, they could be merchants, they could be whatever, but no magic user can have a political position. That's clearly forbidden. There are very, very hard consequences when you break the law with magic. Your powers could be removed, and so is your empathy and your feelings, because powers are linked to your humanity, actually. And this is very, very important. And the second thing is religion, because I've really tried not to consider religion as many universes consider, which is a kind of polytheistic Catholicism. I didn't want that. That is a polytheist world, and the gods are not like the God of the books. It's not God, it's not Yahweh, it's not all-powerful beings. They are more like polytheist gods of ancient Greece, ancient Gaul, and Celtic gods, and stuff like that. That's, I think, two of the main particularities of the universe.
So, Ryan, would you say there's something particularly French about that game?
Gosh, I can't say there's something French about the game, because Julien has built a cosmopolitan, rich, full of cultures and conflicts and various interests that make it heavily international. I experienced through the universe the weight of many different perspectives and visions. And so sometimes the French vibe might emerge in an area of the universe. Yes, maybe there's I don't know which cliche I should go towards. Maybe there's an area that has something connected with food, just to speak of a world cliche of France. Maybe there are areas that have a stronger sense of socialism. Maybe there are areas that have a stronger sense of liberalism. But it's never cliche. It's never, I just use these words because we're talking about it from an outside perspective. The whole universe doesn't have a French vibe. No, because it's a rich one.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I noticed in French games is that they're very maximalist in style, with very beautiful artwork and layout and design. first of all, that speaks to me as a consumer. And I'm like, oh, why don't I speak French? But also it's something I noticed also when I was in Brussels and looked at a couple of games that they're very design heavy on the visual side.
Well, I'm not even sure that from the inside we would notice that, because we're exposed to French market games, but we're also exposed to American market games. And I can't say that I sat down and thought that, French games have the best design. I never thought that.
Of course, I focus on this in the podcast because I look at games from different countries and I try to find, is there some cultural influence?
There is something that does come to mind with what you're speaking about, is that I do find that in France there is a strong will to diversify the number of sources of publications and the number of sources of universes. I don't feel a will to just fold under one unique game setting, one unique world setting. There isn't that spirit. Everyone seems to have a creative emergence that needs to be expressed, which often ends up and results in tables having their DM not only DM, but create a new setting and a new world, which I feel is less the case in at least British and American cultures. Those, the other ones that I might know about, but I don't know about the rest of the world.
I'd say that French games actually are more character focused. Generally, they focus about character story. We create universes, but our universes are not the most important thing. What is important is what the characters will be and will do in these universes. Sometimes there is a kind of poetry in French games that could be reflected by art or by the way the word works. I think about the game Rêve de Dragon, which is a medieval fantasy game, but actually it's about people being in a dragon's dream, hence the name. Yeah, there is a kind of poetry. And the system, for many, many years, it's a bit different now, but the system was not that important. That's why in France, Call of Cthulhu was a huge thing. Huge, I think, second behind D&D, which is a huge thing around the world. And that's why many even fantasy universes are quite different from what D&D gives. You know, the Forgotten Realms, basically, they are like fantasy Western with swords. But it is clearly a Western, West Marshes and stuff like that. It's clearly a kind of Western-themed stuff. It's about colonization, it's about discovery and stuff like that. We like huge universes that will offer something else than this feeling. We want things to be maybe sometimes more realistic. We love realism. There is a big thing about that. There are big games about that. Games about piracy, which is called Pavillon Noir, which is amazingly realistic. So realistic that when you read it, it looks like a history thesis on piracy. Or even games like Dies Irae, which talk about the 100 Years' War, and stuff like that. I think that is a bit what makes French ticks. But we also like American games. We do love Forgotten Realms are absolutely popular here. Iron Kingdoms are popular here, stuff like that. We love steampunk, we love magic punk and stuff like that. So we love a huge diversity. But French games, yeah, they tend to be more realistic and sometimes a bit poetic, arty.
But that would be my next question, or actually my last question. On your channel, you also have some other games, including non-French, but I didn't check if you also have some other specific French games. So what other games do you have there?
We've played quite a lot of games, actually. Ryan was talking about the game we were playing when he came in. It was called Chroniques oubliées contemporains, which is a contemporary game. We were playing a mix of Delta Green and Call of Cthulhu, actually, with a campaign named L'Héritage Greenberg, where they were playing FBI agents. But we have also played My Little Pony, we have played Shadowrun, we have played Starfinder, Dies Irae, that I mentioned earlier, and a lot of other stuff. And we have an actual play in English on a game called Cats, The Conspiracy, which was with Daryl White.
Oh, yeah, I saw that in France. I was in Bordeaux 3 years ago. I went to a game shop there, and there I noticed this, although it has a different name in French, I guess.
It's Cats the Masquerade. That game is available in English as well. French publishers are more and more equipped to publish games in English and distribute them worldwide. I mean, it's been the case for years, but I find there's an actual step up in terms of daring tackling these markets. And I think there's a big thing to be put out there. There's some very interesting ideas. Some are already available and others are coming. But yeah, and Cats is one of them. This actual play has been going for a while, for 7.5 years. The actual play scene is developing quite well in France as well. There's lots of initiatives. The fact that we can be supported by a public shows a real interest of the French public that is growing very fast. There are more and more people playing role-playing games. This is partly due to the American aura that has been very helpful, naturally. But I do think that every time a good thing happens in this field around the world, the French are here and available, and role-playing games has been around and popular long enough, even though there have been some down phases, for there to be a real vibrance that's coming back today. And I can feel it. More and more friends are playing. People that I wouldn't expect playing role-playing games, played role-play games. And there's more and more offers out there on the market. And I think actual plays do play a role in getting the message out there and just at least exposing what's possible. And of course, no one should take an actual play as what's supposed to happen around the table. But it's certainly a place, and there's enough variety in actual plays for you to figure out where your personal balance is along the way. And France is stepping in quite nicely, I find, on an international perspective. Considering the theme of your show, I thought relevant to share that.
We stay a bit with Roll and Play to learn some more about French games and one of the major publishers.
I'm Laura Hoffmann. Initially, I'm German, but I have been living in France for over 20 years now. So I'm more into the cultural setting of French now. And so I have been working in the RPG industry for the past 11 years. And before that, obviously, I discovered RPGs as a passion myself when I was a teenager through friends and have been playing ever since, always trying to find ways to connect, being very active in a board game association, role-playing game association for a while. Every Friday we've been playing, and then I got very lucky in the sense of finding a job in that industry and have been around this world for the past many years. Now I'm playing RPGs for over 20 years now. I've been a board gamer even before that, and it's been a part of my life for a very long time now.
So the first question about this is, did you discover role-playing games in Germany or in France?
So I did discover it the very first time in Germany through my boyfriend back then. He was the very first person to ever tell me about role-playing games, but I never actually played. And then I discovered it at a festival in England, actually, where we just started to create a character and roll some dice. And then I got back to France and I bought D&D 3.5 of the internet, and I started playing with my friends around me, with my sisters. So I started playing with the German friends, with French friends quite early on. And then when I really started to play more, that was in a French role-playing game association club. And back then I was still less confident also with the language and stuff. And it was for me a real big boost back then, discovering at that point a lot of different games, a lot of different kinds how to play, and also the whole cultural background that comes with it, the whole vocabulary. So I have mainly been playing in France.
Which games do you typically play nowadays?
So my kind of go-to games are the same for the past, I think 10, 15 years. I often play Pathfinder, and I often play Chroniques Oubliées Fantasy, which is a very easy and approachable fantasy game released by Black Book Editions. These two games, I love to play them for two main reasons. Chroniques Oubliées is very easy to set up. It's very easy to bring people in. There's nothing that has been prepared in advance for a long time. You just bring that out. The rules are like a few pages, and then the character creation and stuff is very easy. So that's my go-to game if I want to bring in new players or just have a quick fun play. And Pathfinder, I really appreciate it for the depth. I love optimizing my character. I love going into the choices and stuff and building it up. But apart from that, I love experimenting lots of different games. I love different settings and backgrounds. That was one of the things that was really cool in the RPG club I was in, is like for a while, I think every week we played a different game. Somebody was DMing, and then they would just bring in a new game and we would hop into that with new characters, and it was a totally different setting. And so there are tons and tons of games I have really enjoyed. And overall, I'd say I'm open to play any kind of RPG. It's about the group I'm with, the experience that we want to go into, the adventure that we're going to play.
So you said you had a connection to a club. So how can we imagine such clubs? Do they have like a club space where you meet and play? And how important are they in France, these game clubs?
So it was an association, where every Friday night, the city gave them access to a communal space. It was free of charge because it was like a public association. And so the good thing is that RPGs are often played late at night. So Friday night, I think 7 or 8, we had the keys to that location, and then we could play all night long. And sometimes we did play up until the early morning hours, and sometimes just a couple of hours. We were like around 50 people when I was very active there around then. And I think it was like around 3 to 4 tables of RPGs every Friday. And then there were some miniature games going on and some board games. I would say these are quite important in France. In France, they have known the fall of RPGs also in the early 90s through a TV show where there was a woman who was blaming RPGs for being the reason of Satanism and converting the youth to non very safe practices. And so back then they actually closed a lot of clubs and associations in schools and in universities. And so they kind of like limited all of that physical connection space there. But yeah, I would say like in the end of the 90s, early 2000s, that really came back. And they are a big part today still of the way how you can play, meet other players. Obviously, now it has changed more because there's also more online incentive and you can play online with other people you can find. But back when I started to it was really like the best way to find people, players, and to connect. And I wasn't even living in a big city back then. I was living in a tiny town, and the medium-sized city that club was in was like 20 minutes away. So it was not very far. And still, it was very active.
The first interview was with Roll and Play, and you're also involved with them. Can you maybe say a bit about what you do there?
Yes, absolutely. So Roll and Play was initiated by the RPG publisher Black Book Editions. I happened to work for Black Book Editions for the past 11 years. I was not necessarily the person who initiated the project, but I had been following in from the start, and I took over in the role as a producer there very early on. So I managed the project, the fact that it happened, that we were able to shoot and stuff. And then at some point when Black Book Editions was reconsidering whether or not to continue or in which form, just because it's difficult to have like very different businesses inside the same structure, I made an offer of taking over the project, buying up the brand, and then building a new company that would be dedicated to the show, still keeping a connection with Black Book Editions, but making it more focused on that end. And so that is when Ryan and Julien, who were both actors on the show, they decided to build that company with me. And so today I am CEO of the company, and I'm still producing and running the day-to-day business and making sure that everything is set up for the shootings and like all new ventures or crowdfundings or shows or anything new that we might want to do. That kind of like is on my plate most of the time.
So I saw, apart from the show itself, which I saw on YouTube, there are also published books.
Absolutely. So there is the game line Roll and Play Le Jeu de Rôle, which is published by Black Book Editions, which is in link with the show because it's the game that we are playing. But also Julien, who is our GM, is one of the authors of that line. So Roll and Play is a French 5th edition version. So it takes up the SRD rules and then brings in a lot of like French creation, the way, new origins, new classes, and a different approach of presenting the different sections of the book. And so we at Roll and Play played with this game setting and system for our main show most of the time. And it's also a popular alternative 5e edition.
Are there any especially noteworthy issues with translation? Specific terms like monster names or class names?
Yeah, I mean, it's always about the perspective that you put into it. So obviously there were people that really were attached to some of the older terms, but they didn't necessarily translate well in the current context. I do remember some parts which were kind of funny where terms are brands for Wizards of the Coast. So for instance, the title of the book in French, it's Monster Manual. And then you have the French subtitle below it, but you have the English title in big on in front, which is very weird, especially for a market as France, where they are really very attached to the fact that it is in French, and not everybody would feel confident enough to read in English. Whereas in Germany, it's, for instance, as far as I know, a bit easier because German and English is closer, so it's just easier to comprehend many things. But French and English is very different. So That was very funny to me. It was also about sometimes they would send out suggestions about changing some terms to match the way it was spelled in English, but that doesn't make sense, like just switching around some of the letters. And I think the thing that I found most funny at that point was, so we would translate, we would do some of the layouting, and then they would finalize everything. And so initially they didn't even want us to necessarily check the files, but we insisted. And once they sent them back, and one of the maps that was inside it, it was like an image with words on it, and it was the Spanish version instead of being the French version, because for them obviously it's just a foreign language. And we were like, that might not be the correct way to print that, and we got that fixed. But yeah, it's a challenge for nowadays. It's important to have translations for your games because it's such a language dependent game. So people need it in their own language. And then again, like the markets in these specific European countries are so tiny that from an American perspective on these kinds of games, it might seem not very important. But then again, it needs to be done well for players to be able to enjoy it at the same pace. So it's really about finding the right balance there. And that's why European publishers are so important, to be able to understand their local communities and be able to deliver a product that actually matches the culture and the needs and the comprehension and meet the players where they are.
Speaking of European countries and meeting their different cultures, did they ever consider other French-speaking regions of Europe, like Belgium or Switzerland, for the translations, the different forms of French?
I don't think it's really ever been considered in that way. Generally, when something is translated into French, it's translated into French, and that will serve as the base for any Belgian, Canadian, Swiss players as well, because it's the official French of the French market. And I'm not aware of any official translations where they would then adapt it to Canadian French or to Swiss French, because I think the market just goes even tinier. Generally, you can understand French. I don't know how you say that in English. Even if you are from Switzerland or from Belgium specifically. Of course, they have their own local sayings and they have their own languages and they have their own terms and they have their own vocabulary. But in the end, the regular French version is still what they're going to be able to use and play. So yeah, I don't think I'm aware of any official translations that have been adapted to those markets. And I know that we always sold our French productions into those markets, specifically Belgium, Switzerland, Canada would always pick up our product.
So Black Book Editions, they are a publisher and a distributor. And the interesting thing for me here is less the distribution part, although we can talk about that too, but the publishing. So they are the translators of games like Shadowrun, Pathfinder, Daggerheart, or for German games, The Dark Eye. And you will see that in the other you won't see that. The listeners will hear that in the other interviews, that many French role players actually started with the translation of a German game, The Dark Eye, into French. But I'd be mostly interested in the original French games that Black Book has. Can you maybe highlight a couple of noteworthy ones?
Absolutely. So Black Book Editions is a RPG publisher, has been around for over 20 years now here in France, and has always had two main branches, one about creating their own games and one about translating games from other countries, mainly the US, but not only, as with the Dark Eye. The very first game they created themselves was a game called Pavillon Noir, which is a historical pirate game written by somebody who was really, really an expert in everything around it. So it's kind of like an encyclopedia of piratry in the history of the human world, but in the form of a role-playing game. So that's how it started out. And then there have been loads of other games that came on. Today, the two biggest original creations from Black Book Editions are Chroniques Oubliées. Chroniques Oubliées is a game that kind of took the basics of 3.5 and made it simpler, inspired by video games, like what you have kind of like a skill tree where you pick out different capacities that your characters can have. So you will choose the path of, like, I'm a druid and I will pick the path of either like nature or healing or something like this. And I will compose my character in that sense. And that made it a very straightforward, easy to pick up game with rules that really, in the first edition, there were like 4 pages of rules total, and the rest was like character and background. And you had everything you needed to play in one small book. And then obviously you had adventures and stuff to go with. And that line is still very popular. The second edition released like 3 years ago, and still very popular. I think it's one of the most played games because there's a big difference between the games you buy to read or enjoy or play like one campaign with it and the games that you really actively play. And so I think there was a lot of very strong feedback on the play sessions that were there. And Chroniques Oubliées is divided in different versions. So you have Chroniques Oubliées Fantasy, and then you have Chroniques Oubliées Contemporain, which is going to be like a modern day setting where you can play in our own worlds. And then you have other subsections like Chroniques Oubliées Galactique, where you will play in space, or even adaptations where it's other settings like Terre d'Aran. Terre d'Aran is the background, is the world of a very popular French comic book series called Elves and Orcs and Gobelins, and then there are mages and stuff like this. So it's a very popular line. And so Black Book Editions adapted the Chroniques Oubliées game system to serve as a base for an RPG set in that universe. And so there have been lots of different other games that were in the same iterations. Like, for instance, Les Légendaires is a very popular comic book for children, for preteens, I'd say. And so they made a game in that setting as well, based on Chroniques Oubliées. The second very popular game for Black Book Editions is a game called Cats, the Conspiracy in English, but Cats la Mascarade in French. It has been translated into English since then. And it's basically you will be playing cats, but in a very, I don't know, it's kind of like a James Bond-like setting, or not necessarily James Bond, but basically the idea behind it is that cats are obviously the ones that actually are running the world, and they created humankind to be their servants, basically. And then the humans, they found out that this was the case and they started a rebellion. And then cats created like a means of hiding their existence. And humans believed that they were just simple house pets and that humans were in charge, but obviously it's the other way around. And so you have a whole game about protecting the conspiracy of being, not detected by the humans, but also going into missions. And it gives you a real game. It's very weird to be playing cats because you could say, okay, it's just a funny game, and cats is very fun. But what I really like about it is the fact that you can play it in so many different settings. So you can play it just, the life of a cat, or you can play something very funny, or you could play something like an espionage themed setting, or anything really, like you can time travel and do some magic and stuff like this. So those are the big games from Black Book Editions creations. And then obviously there are loads of other games. There are games that have been created in collaboration, like games like Worm, which is a game about prehistoric history created together with the author directly. Then there are adaptations like Roll and Play, Le Jeu de Rôle. We already talked about that one. And then there is a game called Polaris, which has also been translated into English, which is a game in a dystopian future where the Earth has become inhabitable. People had to go live underwater and are now building up their civilizations down there. Very harsh game, but very, very interesting. There are also books that are available in that setting, so you can really immerse yourself in that. So I think that would be like the basic outline. I mean, Black Book Editions has released a lot of games over the 20 years of existence. So there's a lot to talk about, but those would be the main parts. There's definitely one defining factor of the French market overall. It's not only RPGs, it's board games as well. It's kind of like everything, every creation out there is French people are a lot about aesthetics. Products need to be appealing visually. That's the whole French spirit, I think. And so it really depends. There are products that are being translated as they are, but there are products that have had new designs done. It's not necessarily always a question about whether or not it's better. It's just more in tone with the expectations of a local market. And we've done that with Black Book Editions on quite a few products. We've also done our own creations, like for Shadowrun, similar, a bit like in Germany. We have been collaborating with the teams in the US and have also created like settings really about Paris or other cities in the Shadowrun universe. And so really releasing source books that release in that sense. And then, on some other products, we might have adapted the layout to fit existing game lines or redo some of the artwork, add some texts or contexts. We try to adapt. But then again, obviously, when it's about translating and bringing an existing game to a market, it's also about keeping its nature, keeping its essence. And so most of the time, Many of the games, you can just take them as they are and translate them because they will fit internationally. Yeah, it really comes down about looking what is the product, what will read well, and what will make sense, and how can you also reinforce a feeling and a connection, right? I remember when we did Das Schwarze Auge, L'œil noir, the dark eye into French. Well, we did some like goodies that would like really reconcile people with the games that they played when like 30 years ago, like really the boxes with the cardboard cutout GM screen, like really plugging into that nostalgia, because between then and now, well, the dark eye hadn't really been existing a lot in France, where in Germany it had a whole history and everything had been building up over years and years and years. Well, in France, we had to reconnect with the nostalgia that was like tens of years ago. And so those are things that we might recommend or do or adjust.
I'm really interested in these local adaptations or localizations of games. That's one of the reasons I started the podcast, because I noticed that there were country-specific supplements of American games. So I'm really glad you touched on that with the Shadowrun books. So are you aware of any other localizations of big games like World of Darkness games or Call of Cthulhu? I mean, it's usually the real world settings, because for D&D, you don't need a localization to France because there is no France in the Forgotten Realms. But of course, in Shadowrun and World of Darkness, there is.
Yes, absolutely. I know that for Cthulhu, I think for many of their versions, but specifically also the last iterations, like Cthulhu 7th edition at least, they always had local setting-based books that were released. Like there's been books about Marseille, there has been books about France overall. I know that is quite something that's popular when it is possible. It is always for a publisher not necessarily very easy, because it's very different way of going about translating a game than going about creating a game. So it's not the same teams, it's not necessarily the same people. A translator is not a writer in the same sense of creating a game. So it's not always as easy a feat to do, but it's something that at least the local population is generally very, very encouraging about it. So French people will very gladly be interested in settings that are local and tie in their own experiences. I always remember that, right? Being European, I've always watched, obviously, still American movies growing up. And they kind of like always felt like a real fiction, because it was always in a setting that wasn't familiar. And I remember when I first traveled to the US in my life and I saw a real life yellow school bus, it kind of like came together to me, and imagining that American people my age that grew up with the same movies I did, for them it was reality. For me, it was always a bit fantasy. It was always a bit far away, but for them it was a reality. And I think that's something that's quite different. And so when you have your popular game and you can play Shadowrun in Paris or in any other European city, obviously that feels very more familiar. Or even if it's not one of the big brands, but I know that there are more and more now, as I would say, incentives of creating stories that are really, placed into the local setting. And the publisher Les Douze Singes, they did also a Cthulhu campaign. It was not like a Call of Cthulhu official. It was their own rule set system and stuff, but it was like you play cops, but in the French police in Bordeaux. And so you have the whole like French administration stuff to handle and the French way. And it's not as fancy as it might be like when you watch the TV series when they're like in their LA offices and going about it, right? It's just like very down to earth. Yeah, you are in Bordeaux and you have the whole French flavor that goes with it. I personally always thought that those are great incentives. It does limit obviously the, I'd say, potential of a certain game, because it is kind of tough to explain cultural knowledge that is so localized. Like I said, we have all grown up in Europe with the American movies. Americans might not have seen a lot of like very European movies, or it's a very big difference still between a German movie, a French movie, a Swedish movie. So it's just not European. You cannot compare as a European movie. That's going to be the European experience. Every little country is so different. And so obviously if you do something that's very, very localized, the potential of really bringing it to a broader audience internationally has its limitations, at the least, because you have to give way more context to make the situation comprehensive.
We will return to localization and the city of Bordeaux in parts 2 and 3, but in the meanwhile, let's get a historical overview of the gaming scene in France.
My name is Mathieu with one T. So I'm an English teacher and I've been playing role-playing games for too long to truly admit. Must have 35 years, 40 or 40s, 40-ish. I started role-playing games like many people in France with L'Œil Noir, which is the French translation of Das Schwarze Auge. And in France, many people from my generation started with that game because that game was available everywhere in bookstores and not in hobby stores, which was, of course, a huge asset at the time. And then I've never really stopped playing. Sometimes I was not really interested in what was to be published. I was not in the cycle of news for quite a long time because I really focused on Vampire the Masquerade, and I played 17 years, my ongoing campaign. And then after that, I came back to the role-playing games scene in France, thanks to Roliste TV, and this is how I joined the podcast.
Okay, we'll talk about Roliste TV later, but first question about Vampire. When you played that, was it set in the US or in France or somewhere else?
Oh, it was set in the US. I was not really interested in playing in France because to me, role-playing game is about escapism. So I didn't see any interest in playing World of Darkness versions of my city in Normandy, which was Caen at the time. So I played like many people. I started with Gary because no one in France knew where Gary was at the time. It was a pre-internet time. And then I created my own city called Hope in New England. And this is how things started and went for 17 years.
And with the games you currently play, so how would the mix of international games and French games be?
I'm someone running campaigns. I don't like just playing a game for 1 or 2 sessions because I don't think it is worth the investment. So I've been running another campaign for 19 years. Basically, that was right after the end of Vampire. And it is some modern fantasy which takes place in the US in a city called Rainbow City. So it's a city. I found the name flying over the US and I saw in Alabama that there was a town called Rainbow City and I fell in love with the name of this town and I gave the name to that fictional city we're playing. It's called Lost Gods and it's a game where you play the echoes and remembrances of all the gods with everything that can come with that. It's not superhero. It's not World of Darkness. It's really in between. I know the name is not the name we quote a lot now, but it's very inspired by Neil Gaiman and American Gods. And also I have a table with Dungeons and Dragons games and also some more recent games, not very famous, such as Our Brilliant Ruin, that I really fell in love with. It is the last game because we review a lot of games. The latest games, when I closed the book, I said, I need to run this game.
So you said we read a lot of games for reviews. Maybe you can say a bit about Roliste TV, what you do there. What is it about?
We have around 22,000 subscribers, whether on YouTube, Facebook. We are on the major communicating platforms, social networks, pick your name. And we review, games that are sent by French editors. We also work with Chaosium. We work with Free League. We also have interviews of international authors. It's like a second job without the pay. And it takes a lot of time. And it has been now, Roliste TV has been existing for 16 years now, and I've been there for 11, if I remember correctly.
That's quite impressive.
We also work with traditional publishers, and we review books as well. And we went to England, to London, to attend Dragon Meet convention, and we go to the main conventions in France as well. We'll go to Gen Con, and then I'll retire.
So what would be the main conventions in France?
In France, strangely enough, you don't have conventions in Paris. There's one actually, that will be its first year. It's called Ludiverse. It will be next week. But it won't be role-playing games only. It will also be board games, Warhammer, and miniature games. And you have one in Lyon called Octogone, which is the biggest convention where everyone will meet. And it was in October, back to school and back to role-playing game tables. Now it has been moved to May, so we don't know what will really happen with this new date because we have many conventions in France starting spring.
I'd like to ask a few questions about the development of RPGs in France. And since you've been in the scene for, as you said, more than 30 years, maybe you can give some insight into that. So which would have been the first games, either translations or original ones in France?
Oh, very early on the French scene, you had French authors that started to write games. So, of course, we had Dungeons and Dragons, and it took quite some time before the advanced edition to be translated. That was not the case with the Red Box. The Red Box was translated quite rapidly. And also that was quite a story because, with the French legislation, you cannot import a product which doesn't have a French written notice. So it meant that sometimes the game would come, but you would have a very, very light translation. So it would cross the frontier. American games were quite popular, but French games also. We have one called Rêve de Dragon, which is basically, it's a very poetic game in which you play within the dreams of a dragon. It was very modern for the time. Sadly, the system was not modern for the time. And now you have several reprints that have been made, but sadly enough, the new generation is not that interested in that game, even if the scenarios are really great because of the system. The system is tue l'amour, as we say in France, and it kills love. It's a love killer. But games such as Call of Cthulhu, Chaosium games have been quite popular from the outset because the French publisher called Jeux des Cartes translated nearly most of them. So Cthulhu, Warhammer, so of course not Chaosium for Warhammer, but you had all the games. RuneQuest was also translated by another publisher, but Chaosium games were very present from the beginning on the French scene.
Yes, and then what other big original French games were there except Dream of the Dragon?
So you had some, I would say, Dungeons and Dragons inspired games. So the French one, we had Avant Charlemagne. I'm really talking about the early games. I would translate it before Carolus Magnus. We also have a game called Empire Galactique, Galactic Empire, that was from the same author. And apart from that, the American games were very present, as I say to you, and I'm pretty sure that as soon as we move to the next question, some new games will pop up and I will remember them.
I visited France in 2023. I was in some game shops in Bordeaux. And I noticed there were lots and lots of original French games that I had never seen before. So I wrote down the names like Worm, or lots of things with Dungeon, but I'm not sure if that was just Dungeon.
Yeah, it's that's something quite ironic. It's because people will tend to move away from Dungeons and Dragons, but very often you'll find the name Dungeon, the moniker Dungeon. There's one of the huge success at the moment is Donjons et Chatons, Dungeons and Kittens. You see, everything is just you have a D and something as a name. Yeah, that's one of the strengths, I think, of the French market, the sheer number of French games. So most of them, of course, will not have the success of a Call of Cthulhu because Call of Cthulhu is really, really very popular in France. But I would say it was here from the very beginning and this tradition just went on and on. If you look at the games, most of these authors, they play Dungeons and Dragons, and Dungeons and Dragons, even if it's very popular, there is this trademark of you go somewhere, the dungeon, and the fact that you kill someone will give you the resolution of your problem. People tend to think as quite basic, plot-wise, and this is why you have games that are more, I would not say elaborate, but games that want you to experience something else. Even if the American influence, of course, is obvious. That's really something we must not understate.
One thing that really interests me about countries' versions of games or translations, and that's one of the reasons I started the podcast actually back 3 years ago. In some countries, the translations also include localizations or own supplements. And since you've been playing for a while, and you mentioned Call of Cthulhu and World of Darkness. These are typical candidates for that. Are there any specific French supplements or versions of these popular American games?
Yes, there are. So it depends on the contract the French publisher will have with the American one or English one. But yes, that's quite common, especially, for example, for the game Vaesen by Free League. We have one about Alsace. So Alsace is the region around Strasbourg. It's quite common to have any, and even in Call of Cthulhu, of course, we've got very prolific writers. And that's usually a question when a French publisher announces a translation. You'll have the question, will you offer some original material? It's every time. You'll never miss with that. So it's really, in a way, the fact that the French community wants French productions, French adaptations. So it won't be the rules, but they want supplements in which you can find your countries, or if it's locally, of course, or having French scenarios. I'm trying to find if I have one in my library. These are the Cthulhu hack you were talking about. So that's on Hastur. So it's just only scenarios by French writers about Hastur. Here, the one haunting the darkness. Also, you have for Vampire, you have some productions, but things being what they are with Renegade Studios, it's lagged a lot, quite a lot. For RuneQuest as well. RuneQuest also, you had some, and Chaosium, of course, greenlighted the project.
In Germany, there are lots of Call of Cthulhu supplements, very good, high-quality ones from the early 2000s.
Yeah, and in France, we had the one published by Picasso's game, The Day of the Beast, was translated in French. A big box.
Something curious I noticed in an interview and then later was also French authors often use pseudonyms or nicknames. That is something I haven't really encountered. Can you explain that, perhaps?
I have no idea why. And this is something because, for instance, for Rollz TV, we use our proper names. I don't get it. I don't get it why you would use a pseudonym. I mean, just, are you ashamed? I don't get it. And I think that doesn't send a very professional image of our hobby. If you don't want your real name to be used, okay, but just use another name, not something that's obviously a nickname. When I came back to the RPG scene, now 10 years ago, I was really surprised by that because everyone had nicknames. It felt like it was my own football team. It's something I don't understand. Clearly, and I have no clue. I don't know why. I asked the questions quite a lot of times. They said, oh, this is how things are.
One person I interviewed after the interview, I noticed that and then asked, so I didn't record it. And they said it might be the generation that grew up with internet forums and ICQ who just got known with their internet nickname.
Yeah, perhaps. ICQ is dead. Internet forums are dead. So let's live in the present. And yes, why should we have all these strange nicknames if we want to go farther, if we want to go beyond the realm of a community made of grognards, of journey players? This is something quite sad, I think.
Another thing that was mentioned in that context, and maybe you can also explain that background, is something connected to what in the US is called the Satanic Panic. That something similar happened in France.
Yes, it happened with Mireille Dumas. So basically, Mireille Dumas was a TV host, and there was a TV show called Bas les Masques, so Let's See the Naked Truth, in which they talked about role-playing games. And of course, it turned out to be quite detrimental to the hobby. So a lot of people have lived that quite differently. Some would say that was a witch hunt. Some would say, basically, I didn't see the difference. That was one thing. And then some people said that led to the collapse of role-playing games in France. But what we need to know and to have in mind is the role-playing games just collapsed at the same time everywhere in the world, whether US, Europe, because of Magic the Gathering. And we were at the crossroads of that period. But even that, no one would care now about that panic in the 90s. And this is something I tend to reproach and don't like about our communities. Sometimes you had people talking about, oh, Mireille Dumas. Come on, just Mireille Dumas is nearly dead. So, okay, we need to move on.
You had also told me that you work as a proofreader for translations from English to French. Can you maybe comment a bit on Are there any language issues when you transpose it to French? Which ones are the problems in the role-playing scene? What comes up there?
The thing was, games were poorly translated in French at the beginning, and these poor translations just stayed and stuck because you could not change the way it was translated, especially for Call of Cthulhu, where, for example, Spot Hidden, the main skill, was translated by Trouver objet caché, which means finding hidden object. Whereas Spot Hidden, you could find anything hidden, not only as an object. So sometimes it leads to some very weird sentences, such as if the investigators look at the sky and make a spot hidden roll, they'll find the constellation. And in French is if they look at the sky, they need to find an object, which is the constellation. Some also translations where bad translations came from video games and then came into role-playing games. Translating a role-playing game is not very easy because you need to find someone who has skills good enough in English, but also skills good enough in role-playing games. And it has happened to me quite a lot of having to reread translators that had not a lot of knowledge in role-playing games, or especially in the game they were translated, and you could feel it, and sometimes it led to disasters I hope I avoided.
I think I have never read in translation of a French game, but I know that even in German some exist, like Nephilim is available in German.
Oh, yeah. And Nephilim is not the easiest game to translate.
So let's just, as an overview, French games that have been translated into English, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't have a complete list, it would be Nephilim, then In Nomine.
Yeah, In Nomine was one of the first games by an author named Croc, and he was the number one author in the early generation, and his game was translated by Steve Jackson Games. You play angels and demons, and of course, French mentality, not being the American mentality, they had to remove many things that were deemed too extreme for the American audience, which made us French laugh a lot.
So too extreme meaning sexual references and blasphemy.
Yeah, sexual references. And the game actually, the full name is In Nomine Satanis. And the Satanis was dropped for the American version.
I think the German one included the full name. I think I read a few pages of the German translation, and I think it wasn't censored. There, the French and Germans are probably more similar in that Americans censor sexuality, and in Europe at the time, 80s, 90s, they more censored violence, at least in Germany.
Yeah, just to give you an idea, Stormbringer, the role-playing game, was published in French with French illustrations, and you had half-naked women, and which to us teenagers were, wow, that was great. And when the Chaosium published a new version of Stormbringer, they took some of the French illustrations, but they covered the ladies.
Yes. Yeah, I think the Schwarze Auge was also a bit risky at times in the beginning.
Yes, and Schwarze Auge, this is when I reread the new version that I realized how sensual it could have been. Things that were then when we played it and when we read the books completely eluded us. So I don't know if that's the French editor who modified some stuff or if that was something we did not notice.
And then I think there was also a French game called Agon.
Agon, it's from a series of French fantasy books. You also have, Dungeons and Kittens has been crowdfunded to have an English version. Also, you have another game called Knight, like Knight of the Round Table, in which you play futuristic King Arthur in a post-apocalyptic world. And you've got huge armors like robots. And the game also was crowdfunded to be available in an English version in the United States. But it's very difficult for a French role-playing game to be widely available in the US.
Yeah, I remember seeing that in France, that there were these huge books of Knight, and I skimmed through them and I understood that with 2 years of school French, that it was about Arthurian legend, but it's in a cyber world, kind of.
Yes, and it's the latest big French role-playing game franchise to have been created, because we tend to play with the same games over and over, and Knight just broke the cycle.
And I think they also translated Cats the Conspiracy. Or is that the same one you talked about before?
No, it's another one. French people love cats and kittens. So in French, the call is Cat the Masquerade. It's an obvious wink at Vampire the Masquerade. It's a very nice game. You play cats, and cats rule the world. And the latest campaign took place in the US. You have to cross the US by car. So imagine that when you're a cat. Very nice game, very pleasant game, and very, I would say, modern game, because nowadays, now we tend to have lighter games. So it won't take you 400 pages and 6 months to gather all your friends. So it's typically what I would say the new generation games, and the ones I really appreciate, even if I don't play them.
Yeah, the Germans like pets too, because they did a Das Schwarze Auge pet version where it's set in the same world, but then you are the dogs and cats, which have adventures on the rooftops, but in the same setting as Das Schwarze Auge.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Other role-playing publications. So one thing I noticed is Casus Belli seems to be important. Can you say a bit about them?
Sadly, Casus Belli is gone now.
I saw them in Brussels.
Yes, but you saw number 50, which was the last issue.
Ah, okay.
Casus Belli has been the linking point of several generations of hobbyists. It was the early magazine. At one point, it's quite difficult to imagine now, but you had up to 4 role-playing game magazines everywhere in newsstands. And Casus Belli was a survivor, so it has experienced, I think, 4 editions. And you saw the last one. You found the magazines in specialized stores. But the format of role-playing game press had to be thought again. Because at the time, so it was every 2 months, well, you didn't have the internet. And the internet killed the first version of Casus Belli, because why would I wait 2 months to get the review of a game when I can have it 2 weeks after the game is released? So all the news part of Casus Belli made it, and I'm not talking about the latest version, made it quite irrelevant. The latest version was quite good because they came with a game called Chroniques Oubliées, so Forgotten Chronicles, which is a Dungeons and Dragons light game, hugely popular in France, hugely popular. And the game was in the first issue or the second, I don't remember, but all of a sudden, each time you would buy the magazine, the news were there, but you would buy to get some new material about a game or about a universe. And I would say a constant of the time, and it's also quite revealing that all these magazines just disappeared. So yes, and the publisher of Casus Belli is not very well as well, Black Book Edition. It's a sign of time. And that was very sad. As everywhere, the community is aging. I'm about to shoot a video about it. My next video will be, what about in 10 years? How will the role-playing game scene in France and everywhere else will be in 10 years? Because one of the early generations will be gone. And when I mean gone, not dead, but not active anymore. And this is something that is quite critical, because when we see conventions, the age average is quite high. Most of them are actually people from my generation. So many people are between, I would say, 40 and 55. And I'm nice about it. And this is clearly something that is worth watching. It's how the game will evolve. What will be the appeal of the 10th edition of such and such games that were not played by this younger generation. You see, in my room, I can see my old collection of D&D games, D&D boxes, Judge Dredd, ElfQuest, all of these games. And these games I grew up with, but that are absolutely unknown to a new generation. So what will happen of all of that when we lose the link between the, I would not say the pioneers, but between the players who were there from the beginning, this link with the actual production of games. You know, when I see people telling me, oh, you know, I've never played Call of Cthulhu. Oh, I never played Dungeons and Dragons in a very apologetic way. I always reply, you don't have to play these games to enjoy role-playing games. And we can see how Hasbro is trying to do something about Dungeons and Dragons with the chaos we all know. So this is clearly something, and this is why I like Knight, because Knight to me is one of the new representative of this new generation, because players will be gone, and you know what I mean by gone, but the same will be for publishers, because publishers are usually players from the 90s. And what will become of all of that? And this is clearly the question we always ask ourselves at Rollist TV, and this is also the goal of our podcast, creating a link between new games and old games, old gamers and new gamers. And that's quite difficult because, you know, the French, they love to bicker. And when they love to bicker, it's sometimes difficult to have a communication.
So thank you for listening to part 1 of episode 28. And you can get part 2 right away because there's so much more.